50 million years ago, the North Pole was not an icy wasteland. Thick mist drifted above warm water, forests grew along the shores, and parts of the ancient Arctic Ocean may have been covered by an unbroken green carpet. It was created not by trees or algae, but by a tiny floating fern called Azolla. Today, several of these plants could easily fit in the palm of your hand. Yet during the Eocene, countless generations of Azolla may have interfered with the climate system of the entire planet. They removed carbon from the atmosphere, reproduced rapidly, died, and sank into the depths. This gave rise to one of paleoclimatology's boldest hypotheses. A nearly invisible organism may have helped cool an overheated Earth, but the green Arctic hides the central conflict of this story. Did Azolla truly help push the planet from a hot greenhouse climate toward long-term cooling? Or have scientists mistaken an unusual local event for the cause of a global transformation? To understand why this idea appeared at all, we must return to the early Eocene. Earth was living in a greenhouse state. Permanent polar ice caps did not exist. Sea levels were higher, and the atmosphere contained far more carbon dioxide than it does today. The high latitudes still endured months of winter darkness, but the familiar Arctic cold had not yet arrived. Humid forests grew across the islands of the Canadian Arctic. Among them lived turtles, ancient relatives of alligators, and mammals, unlike any modern inhabitants of the far north. The Arctic Ocean itself was also arranged differently. It was almost enclosed, and its exchange with neighboring seas was restricted by shallow passages. The warm climate brought heavy rainfall and increased river runoff. Rivers carried enormous quantities of fresh water into the ocean. Because fresh water is lighter than salt water, it could spread across the surface as a thin seasonal layer. This fragile boundary between fresh surface water and the salty depths created an opportunity for Azolla. Azolla can do something most plants cannot. Inside small cavities in its leaves live cyanobacteria capable of taking nitrogen directly from the air. This close partnership gives the fern a major advantage. With enough light, warmth, and phosphorus, it can multiply at an extraordinary rate. During the polar summer, the sun remained above the horizon for weeks. Rivers delivered nutrients from the surrounding continents. The calm layer of fresh water protected the plant from the saltier ocean below. Within days, individual patches could greatly increase their mass, joining together into dense floating mats. Seen from above, this ocean would have looked almost impossible. Not blue water surrounded by white ice, but a dull green plain beneath a low, warm sky. Wind breaks the carpet into long strips. Ripples pass through it, and the surface closes again. Yet rapid growth alone does not cool the climate. A plant absorbs carbon dioxide, but decomposition can return that carbon to the environment. To influence the entire planet, Azolla had to do more than grow. The carbon locked inside its tissues had to be hidden from the atmosphere for an extremely long time. This is where the ancient Arctic may have become a gigantic natural carbon trap. Fresh water remained near the surface, saltier water stayed below, and the two layers mixed poorly. Oxygen levels in the depths fell. When the polar summer ended and the long darkness returned, part of the green covering died. Tiny plants slowly sank through the nearly motionless water and disappeared into the black depths. On an ordinary seafloor, bacteria would have quickly broken them down. Much of their carbon would then have returned to the ocean and atmosphere. But in an oxygen-poor environment, decomposition slowed. The remains of the ferns became buried in mud, while the carbon they had captured remained locked inside the sediments. This cycle may have repeated season after season for almost 800,000 years. Each individual plant was insignificant, but together they created a continuous conveyor belt. Carbon dioxide from the air, living tissue at the surface, and organic material buried on the seafloor. If the blooms covered a large part of the basin, their effects could have reached far beyond the Arctic. Evidence for this strange world came not from the ocean surface, but from beneath its floor. During an international drilling expedition on the Lomonosov Ridge, researchers recovered sediment cores, long cylinders preserving a sequence of vanished ages. In layers dating to around 48.5 million years ago, scientists discovered thousands of extremely thin deposits, rich in Azolla spores and plant remains. They also found traces of other freshwater organisms. This did not look like a single fern accidentally carried into the ocean by a river. It looked like a repeating signal lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Azolla remains have also been found farther south, in sediments from northern seas. Fresh Arctic water may sometimes have spilled outward, carrying the floating fern far from the main blooming area. The pieces seem to fit together: an isolated ocean, a freshwater surface, explosive plant growth, and an oxygen-poor seafloor. The timing also matched an early stage of Earth's long transition from a greenhouse world toward a cooler climate. For a moment, the mystery appeared almost solved, but events that occur at the same time are not necessarily connected by cause and effect. The global climate does not change through a single process, and the Azolla hypothesis has a serious problem. Carbon dioxide was also being removed by weathering rocks, marine plankton, and terrestrial ecosystems. Ocean gateways were changing, currents were being reorganized, and heat was being redistributed between the seas. More importantly, scientists still do not know how far the green covering extended. A later study of the western part of the ancient Arctic basin found Azolla beside marine organisms and large quantities of plant material washed in from the land. This supports another possibility. The fern may have grown mainly in rivers, lakes, swamps, and deltas before being carried into the sea. At that time, the Lomonosov Ridge stood near a smaller, partly isolated basin that may not have represented conditions across the entire Arctic Ocean. If the freshwater layer existed only there, the blooming area would have been far smaller. The amount of carbon that Azolla could permanently bury would then fall dramatically. There is another question. How stable was this mechanism? Even with enormous productivity, Azolla could cool the climate only if its remains sank quickly and stayed buried. Storms, salt water, or an influx of oxygen could have broken this chain. The sediment cores suggest that increasing exchange with neighboring seas may eventually have ended the Arctic blooms. Warmer, saltier water entered the basin. The layers began to mix, and the freshwater surface became unstable. The green world disappeared, not because the fern exhausted the ocean, but because the geography and movement of water changed. This makes the story more complicated, but it does not make Azolla irrelevant. The fern may have been an important participant in the cooling without being its only cause. It may have strengthened a process that had already begun and temporarily accelerated the removal of carbon. Earth still required millions of years of further change. Only much later did a major ice sheet grow across Antarctica, pushing the planet fully into a colder climatic state. The answer, therefore, remains honest and uncomfortable. We cannot prove that a tiny fern cooled the Earth by itself, but we do know that something extraordinary happened in the ancient Arctic. Vast quantities of a freshwater plant appeared again and again, and some of the carbon trapped inside them was buried in the seafloor. Perhaps this was not enough to transform the global climate, or perhaps it provided the extra push that helped Earth slowly cross a critical boundary. Azolla reminds us that planets are not changed only by asteroids, volcanoes, and moving continents. Sometimes a turning point is built from countless quiet processes, each almost invisible on its own. 50 million years ago, the Arctic Ocean may have turned green as the atmosphere began to lose some of the heat it had been holding. The evidence of that vanished world still lies beneath the Arctic seabed. It brings us back to the question from the beginning. Could one of the smallest plants become part of one of the greatest changes in Earth's history? There is still no final answer, and that is exactly why the green Arctic remains one of the most remarkable climate mysteries of the ancient world.